The super empath never destroys the narcissist through cruelty, revenge, or manipulation. The destruction begins the moment the empath finally stops explaining their heart to someone committed to misunderstanding it. That is the part most people never talk about. Everyone expects the empath to stay soft forever. Everyone expects endless forgiveness, endless patience, endless emotional labor, endless chances. But what the world fails to understand is that the super empath reaches a point where their spirit simply cannot bleed anymore. And once that moment arrives, something changes inside them permanently. This is not anger in the ordinary sense. This is awakening. The super empath has spent years absorbing pain that never belonged to them. They carried conversations after everyone else emotionally checked out. They held relationships together with pure emotional endurance. They excused behavior that should have shattered trust long ago, because they kept believing there was still goodness hidden underneath the damage. And narcissists sense this kind of empath immediately. They sense the compassion. They sense the loyalty. They sense the emotional depth. But most importantly, they sense the empath's willingness to stay. That is why the narcissist becomes so attached to the empath's energy in the first place. The narcissist feeds off emotional reactions, validation, emotional rescue, and constant reassurance. Meanwhile, the empath keeps trying to love harder, understand deeper, and heal wounds they never created. And this is where it gets really interesting. The narcissist believes the empath's kindness means weakness. That assumption becomes their biggest mistake. Because the super empath is not weak. The super empath is restrained. There is a massive difference. A genuine super empath possesses emotional intelligence powerful enough to read entire rooms in seconds. They notice tiny shifts in tone. They feel emotional inconsistencies immediately. They sense manipulation before words are even spoken. But for most of their life, they silence those instincts because they want harmony more than conflict. Until one day, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The lies repeat, the manipulation repeats, the gaslighting repeats, the emotional exhaustion becomes unbearable. And eventually the empath stops asking, "How can this relationship be saved?" Instead, they begin asking, "Why has the empath been abandoning themselves just to keep someone else comfortable?" That question changes everything. Because once the super empath awakens, the narcissist loses access to the one thing they depended on most: unlimited emotional supply. The first way a super empath destroys a narcissist is through emotional detachment. Not screaming, not revenge, not chaos, silence, calmness, distance. The narcissist expects emotional reactions because emotional reactions create control. They expect begging. They expect tears. They expect emotional chasing. But the awakened empath becomes emotionally unavailable to manipulation. And nothing terrifies a narcissist more than losing emotional access to someone they thought would always stay attached. The empath begins responding differently. Shorter conversations, less emotional explaining, less defending, less overgiving. And the narcissist feels the shift immediately. Here's what most people don't understand about the super empath. Their energy was the entire foundation holding the relationship together. The narcissist may have dominated the dynamic outwardly, but emotionally, the empath carried everything. Once the empath withdraws that energy, the narcissist begins collapsing under the weight of their own emptiness. And the narcissist cannot understand why the old manipulation suddenly stops working. Because the empath finally sees the pattern. That awareness alone is devastating to narcissistic control. The second way a super empath destroys a narcissist is by becoming impossible to confuse. This is so specific to genuine empaths. For years, the empath questioned themselves constantly. They second-guessed intuition. They ignored inner warnings. They believed the narcissist's version of reality over their own emotional truth. Every argument became mental exhaustion. Every disagreement became self-doubt. But awakening changes perception completely. Suddenly, the empath notices every contradiction, every fake apology, every guilt tactic, every emotional performance. And once the empath sees manipulation clearly, the illusion can never fully work again. That is the true nightmare for the narcissist. Because narcissists survive through distortion. They need confusion. They need emotional fog. They need the empath doubting their own instincts. But the super empath eventually becomes emotionally impossible to gaslight. The empath starts trusting energy instead of words, patterns instead of promises, consistency instead of emotional performances, and the narcissist begins losing psychological control little by little. The third way a super empath destroys a narcissist is through self-worth. This part changes everything. The empath spent so long believing love required sacrifice. They believed being needed meant being valued. They believed enduring pain proved loyalty. But eventually, the empath realizes something heartbreaking. The narcissist never loved the empath's soul. They loved the empath's availability. That realization cuts deeply, but it also frees the empath forever. Because once the empath understands their value, the desperation disappears. The fear of abandonment disappears. The compulsive need to fix everyone disappears. And suddenly, the narcissist no longer holds emotional power over them. The super empath begins setting boundaries that cannot be manipulated. Access becomes limited. Energy becomes protected. Peace becomes the priority. And narcissists hate boundaries because boundaries expose entitlement. The narcissist becomes frustrated because the empath no longer tolerates disrespect disguised as emotional neediness. The empath no longer confuses chaos with passion. The empath no longer sacrifices mental stability to keep dysfunctional relationships alive. This is not cruelty. This is self-respect finally awakening after years of emotional survival mode. And this is where the narcissist begins unraveling internally. Because the empath they once controlled now feels emotionally untouchable. The fourth way a super empath destroys a narcissist is through indifference. Not hatred, indifference. Hatred still contains emotional attachment. Hatred still feeds emotional energy into the connection. But indifference starves narcissistic control completely. The narcissist expects emotional obsession forever. The empath eventually gives emotional neutrality instead. And that silence becomes louder than any argument ever could. The empath stops reacting, stops chasing, stops proving, stops fighting for understanding that was never truly desired in the first place. And the narcissist becomes deeply unsettled because emotional access has disappeared. What the world calls coldness, the universe calls healing. Because the empath finally understands something life-changing. Not every battle deserves emotional participation. That realization transforms the super empath into someone almost unrecognizable to the narcissist. Calmer, clearer, harder to manipulate, harder to drain. The fifth way a super empath destroys a narcissist is by thriving afterward. This may be the most painful part for the narcissist of all. The narcissist expected permanent damage, permanent heartbreak, permanent emotional dependence. Instead, the empath rebuilds, slowly at first, quietly at first, but powerfully. The empath reconnects with intuition, reconnects with peace, reconnects with creativity, reconnects with identity. And once the empath begins healing, their energy changes completely. People notice it. Rooms notice it. Life responds to it. Because the empath was never weak. They were exhausted. There is a difference. The super empath becomes magnetic after healing because their energy no longer leaks into toxic dynamics. Their compassion becomes balanced with discernment. Their kindness becomes paired with boundaries. Their sensitivity becomes wisdom instead of self-destruction. And narcissists often cannot handle witnessing the empath evolve without them. Because the narcissist expected the empath to collapse permanently after the relationship ended. Instead, the empath transforms. That transformation exposes the truth. The narcissist was never the source of the empath's light. The empath carried the light all along. And finally, the sixth way a super empath destroys a narcissist is by exposing them without saying a word. This happens naturally. The narcissist carefully constructs false images for the world. They survive through perception management. They manipulate narratives. They perform identities. But once the empath fully disconnects emotionally, the narcissist often begins exposing themselves through desperation. The manipulation intensifies. The emotional games intensify. The mask slips more frequently. Meanwhile, the empath remains grounded in truth. No dramatic revenge, no public destruction, no obsession, just clarity. And clarity is incredibly threatening to people who survive through illusion. The empath's calm energy alone becomes a mirror the narcissist cannot tolerate looking into for too long. Because deep down, narcissists often know exactly what they destroyed. They know genuine emotional depth is rare. They know authentic loyalty is rare. They know unconditional understanding is rare. But by the time they fully recognize the empath's value, the empath has usually awakened beyond emotional return. That is the consequence narcissists never prepare for. The empath eventually stops shrinking. The empath eventually stops begging for bare minimum effort. The empath eventually stops translating their soul for emotionally unavailable people. The empath eventually realizes their sensitivity was never the weakness, it was the warning system. And once the super empath fully understands their own energy, relationships change forever. They stop forcing connections, stop chasing emotionally inconsistent people, stop romanticizing emotional pain, stop confusing trauma with love. Instead, they begin choosing peace over chaos, alignment over attachment, truth over illusion. And this message reaches genuine empaths differently. Because deep down, the empath already knows this story intimately. They remember the exhaustion, the confusion, the emotional whiplash, the endless overthinking, the moments they question their own sanity while trying to love someone incapable of healthy emotional reciprocity. But the empath also feels something else now: relief. Because finally, someone explained what actually happened beneath the surface. This was never weakness, never foolishness, never failure. The empath loved deeply because depth exists naturally inside them. But now the empath understands something even more important. Their compassion must include themselves too. That realization changes the entire trajectory of their life. And if this resonates deeply with the empath's experience, drop a comment below and let it be known. If this is the empath's truth, claim it proudly. Like and subscribe if this message found the exact soul it was meant to reach, because this was not random. The empath was led here for a reason. Somewhere along the way, the empath began forgetting who they were underneath the emotional exhaustion. They became so focused on surviving manipulation that they disconnected from their own power. But that power never disappeared. It waited. It waited beneath the people-pleasing, beneath the emotional burnout, beneath the self-doubt, beneath the silence. And now the awakening begins. The super empath no longer apologizes for feeling deeply, no longer apologizes for needing honesty, no longer apologizes for protecting their peace. Because what others call too sensitive was actually heightened awareness all along. The empath feels energy before words arrive. They sense danger before evidence appears. They recognize emotional shifts before anyone else notices them. That is not weakness. That is intelligence beyond surface reality. And once the empath embraces that truth fully, the narcissist loses the ability to control the narrative forever. Because awakened empaths become untouchable in ways narcissists cannot understand. Not untouchable through ego, untouchable through inner clarity. And clarity changes everything. The empath finally sees themselves clearly. The empath finally trusts themselves completely. The empath finally chooses themselves unapologetically. And from that moment forward, nothing manipulative survives in their presence for very long anymore.